Welcome to 1337. Welcome to the future.
Welcome to 1337, the future of podcasts on the human element. I'm Max, your guide to understanding human behavior.
And I'm Sophia, here to explore the depths of the human psyche with you.
Today we're going medieval.
Ooh, medieval.
But not on knights and castles like you might think.
Okay.
We're tackling a topic that might surprise you.
All right, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Sex in the Middle Ages.
Wow, that's not what I was expecting. This should be interesting.
Yeah, we've got a ton of research, historical records, even some pretty racy literature to bust myths about how people really navigated love and lust back then.
You know, it's funny how our modern views can totally warp how we see the past. I mean, think Game of Thrones or those bodice ripper romance novels.
Right.
But that's all fantasy. We're going to dig into the nuances, and trust me, it's way more interesting than any fiction.
So to kick things off, I was blown away by how differently they thought about desire. It wasn't about attraction like we know it, but sex as something one person does to another with these active and passive roles.
Oh, interesting.
And get this, it applied even in same-sex relationships.
That's a really important point. Today, we talk about sexual orientation, but that concept didn't really exist then. They saw things more in terms of natural versus unnatural, or licit versus illicit.
So like a kiss on the lips could mean something totally different back then. Today, it was usually romantic, but in the Middle Ages, it could be a sign of respect or even seal a political deal.
Yeah. Can you imagine sealing a business deal with a kiss today?
I mean, some people might like that.
True. But it just shows how much the meaning of even simple actions can change over time. And speaking of powerful forces shaping behavior, we can't forget about the church.
Oh yeah, the church had a lot to say about what went on or didn't go on in the bedroom. Premarital sex.
Forbidden.
Masturbation.
Generally off the table.
Virginity.
That's old standard.
All driven by the fear of, eternal damnation. Pretty intense, right?
It was. The belief was that original sin was actually transmitted through sex, which just amplified that fear. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The church also endorsed marriage for procreation, and there was always forgiveness for those who repented.
Seems like a bit of a contradiction, though, right? On one hand, you've got the church advocating for what they called marital debt, meaning spouses were obligated to have sex with each other.
Yeah.
But then they also restricted sex to certain times and positions. Talk about mixed messages.
It really highlights that tension between religious ideals and, human nature. And that tension becomes even more interesting when we look at how medieval medicine viewed sex.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Leeches and bad smells.
Right.
But medieval medicine had its own logic based on this theory of the four humors.
Right. And within that system, they saw sex as a form of excretion. Beneficial in moderation, but dangerous in excess. Too much or too little could throw your humors out of whack and make you ill.
So too much sex was bad, but so was too little. That's a new one.
It was all about balance. And this even extended to their understanding of what we now call STDs. They were particularly concerned about leprosy, which they thought could be transmitted through sex, even though their understanding of how wasn't quite accurate.
Yeah, some of their theories about transmission are pretty wild. Like, imagine thinking a leper's semen could linger in a woman's uterus, turning into harmful vapors that would then infect her next partner.
Wow.
That's some serious misinformation. But hey, they were trying to make sense of the world with what they knew.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to see how they tried to rationalize these things. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how society as a whole tried to control sexual behavior, because it wasn't just the church laying down the law.
Oh yeah, things could get pretty intense. You had rules, punishments, and this deep-seated belief that individual sins could, bring down divine punishment on the whole community.
Right. And they weren't messing around when it came to enforcing those beliefs. Punishments ranged from flogging and branding to public humiliation. One example that really stands out is this practice called running in France and Spain.
Running?
Yeah, they would strip adulterers naked, tie them together, and parade them through the streets. Talk about public shaming.
Yikes. Definitely not something you'd want to experience. But it is interesting to consider that even with all these attempts at control, there was also a surprising amount of pragmatism when it came to certain offenses. like adultery.
That's true. For example, some argued that men's adultery was a greater sin because, men were supposed to have more self-control than women. There's even a suggestion that some recognize the role of male violence and drunkenness in driving women to adultery.
Wow, that's a pretty nuanced take for the time.
Yeah.
So given all these rules and anxieties, how did people actually go about, finding a partner and navigating courtship in the Middle Ages?
Well, it was a lot more complicated than just swiping right on an app.
Right.
There were all sorts of rules about who you could and couldn't marry.
Like making sure your potential spouse wasn't related to you, and not just in the obvious sense, right?
No.
They were talking distant cousins and even spiritual kin, like godparents. I mean, it's like, how many people were even left to choose from?
Exactly. And then there was the question of age. While the legal age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, in Northern Europe at least, most people actually married in their early to mid-20s. So child marriage wasn't as common as some might think, especially among the lower classes.
Okay, that's good to know, because I was picturing everyone getting hitched in their teens.
Yeah.
So what about consent? Did that even factor into arranged marriages, which were, so common back then?
Actually, yes. Consent was still considered important, even in arranged marriages. It wasn't all about forced unions and loveless marriages. And it's important to remember that the concept of romantic love did exist in the Middle Ages, though it was often idealized through traditions like courtly love.
Courtly love. Knights writing poems and serenading their ladies. So what did medieval folks find attractive in a potential partner?
Well, the ideal woman seems to have been embodied by the biblical figure Bathsheba. Blonde, pale-skinned, slim, with delicate features. Larger breasts were actually seen as a sign of promiscuity, so small breasts were definitely in.
Small breasts and pale skin. I guess tanning salons wouldn't have been a big hit back then.
Yeah.
What about the guys? What was the ideal man like?
For men, it was all about being tall, strong, and well-proportioned, with plenty of body hair to symbolize masculinity. Think rugged and hairy, not smooth and sculpted like today's ideals.
It's amazing how much beauty standards have changed over time.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the whole courtship thing. Let's say you found a suitable partner who wasn't related to you and met all the beauty standards. What happened next? Was it straight to the altar?
Not necessarily. While premarital sex was officially forbidden, it definitely happened, especially among the lower classes.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you got married before a baby arrived.
Yeah. That was the general idea. But even then, it was risky. You could face fornication charges, damage your reputation, or even end up in court over a broken promise of marriage.
Right. One of the sources mentions a woman suing her former fiancé for child support after he broke off their engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So premarital sex definitely had consequences. But there's another side to this coin that I found fascinating. Some sources suggest that refusing to have sex before marriage could also be problematic.
That's right. There was a real fear of love magic being used to force unwanted desire. People worried about being tricked into having sex with someone they didn't want to through love potions, spells, and other magical means.
Love potions and spells. That sounds like something straight out of a fairy tale.
It does, but they took it very seriously. There are stories about women slipping menstrual blood into drinks, men using demonic magic to force themselves on others. It speaks to a very real concern about consent, even if the methods seem outlandish to us today.
So it was a bit of a catch-22. Have sex before marriage and risk social and legal repercussions, or refuse and risk being targeted by love magic. Talk about pressure. And then there's the whole phenomenon of lovesickness.
Right. It's fascinating how they viewed lovesickness as a legitimate medical condition, often afflicting wealthy young men who couldn't have the object of their affections.
And the cure? Travel and distractions. Kind of like a medieval spa vacation. But all joking aside, it's clear that courtship had its own unique set of challenges. So what happened once you actually tied the knot? Was it happily ever after?
Well, even within marriage, things weren't always straightforward. While the church recognized the importance of sex for procreation, they also had a lot to say about how that sex should happen. And that's where the concept of marital debt comes in again.
Ah, yes, marital debt. The idea that spouses were obligated to have sex with each other whenever one of them demanded it.
Exactly. And by the 12th century, this was taken so seriously that there were only a few acceptable reasons to refuse, like being insane or about to give birth.
Even then, it seems like the church was more concerned with preventing husbands from straying than with respecting a woman's right to say no. There was no concept of marital rape in this context, which is pretty disturbing.
Unfortunately, that's true. It reflects the power imbalances of the time and the limited agency women had within marriage. But it's important to remember that we're talking about ideals here. How these ideas played out in real life is a different story. And that's something we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes surprising world of medieval sexuality.
Welcome back to our deep dive into medieval sexuality. Last time we uncovered some pretty shocking stuff about societal norms, the church's influence, and even the practicalities of marriage.
Yeah. We also talked about how ideas about gender and sexuality weren't as rigid as we might think. Remember Eleanor Reichner, the transgender sex worker? And those intriguing tomb markers that hint at same-sex relationships.
Right. It's like peeling back layers of history and finding these glimpses of real people who challenge the norms. But today, we're going even deeper into medieval culture, specifically how sex was portrayed in art and literature. Get ready for some surprises because things are about to get interesting.
One thing that really surprised me was how sex sometimes pops up in unexpected places, like those Sheelina gigs carved into churches throughout Europe.
Sheelina gigs. Those sound familiar, but I can't quite place them.
Imagine these grotesque figures, often female, with exaggerated genitalia, carved right into doorways, arches, even fonts, in churches.
Hold on. In churches? What were they thinking?
That's the million-dollar question. Scholars have been debating their meaning for centuries. Some think they're pagan leftovers. Others say they were meant to ward off evil.
Like a magical vulva talisman. That's wild.
Exactly. Others think they were cautionary, symbolizing the dangers of childbirth or lust. But the truth is, we just don't know for sure. It's a medieval mystery.
And it's not just those Sheelina gigs, right? You mentioned other examples of, shall we say, explicit art in churches.
Oh yeah, there's this fantastic carving above the monks' choir at Norwich Cathedral, showing a man who's, well, very proud of his anatomy. Apparently it was meant as a warning against drunkenness.
Okay, but why that imagery? It's like they were speaking in this secret symbolic language we don't quite understand anymore.
Right. And it's not just the carvings. Even those beautiful illuminated manuscripts have surprises hidden in plain sight.
You mean those detailed handwritten books? I thought those were all about religious stories and stuff.
They are, but the margins are where things get juicy. Scribes would doodle all sorts of things in the margins, and some of it is, well, let's just say it's not very holy.
Okay, you gotta give me an example. What kind of naughty doodles are we talking about?
Well, picture this. Nuns frolicking with let's call it a penis tree.
A penis tree. I'm trying to picture that, and it's something else. What's the explanation for that?
There isn't one. It's just this bizarre, hilarious image that makes you wonder what those monks were really thinking about when they were supposed to be copying scripture.
It's like finding a secret stash of dirty jokes hidden in a monastery. Did they doodle anything else?
Well, there are these fascinating things called genitalia patches found mainly in the Netherlands. They're literally patches shaped like penises and vulvas.
Genitalia patches.
Yeah.
Like, were people wearing these things?
That's the mystery. Were they worn openly? Hidden under clothes? Good luck charms? Erotic talismans? Or just a medieval way of poking fun at society? We just don't know.
It blows my mind how these little patches can raise so many questions about how people lived centuries ago. It makes you realize there's so much we don't know, so much we can only guess at.
Exactly. And it's not just the art. Medieval literature is full of examples, too. Some subtle, some shockingly direct. We've got to talk about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, for example.
Oh yeah, Chaucer. I remember reading some of that in college. Wasn't it pretty racy for its time?
Absolutely. It's a masterpiece of social commentary. And Chaucer definitely wasn't shy about depicting the, shall we say, earthier side of medieval life.
Like the Miller's Tale, right? With the cuckolded husband, the lusty wife, and all that slapstick humor.
And let's not forget the fart jokes. Chaucer definitely knew how to make his audience laugh, even if it meant pushing the boundaries of what was considered appropriate.
It's interesting how, even in a highbrow literary work, there's this undercurrent of ribaldry, this willingness to joke about sex and bodily functions.
Right. It shatters that whole image of the Middle Ages as being totally repressed and prudish. They clearly had a sense of humor, and they weren't afraid to use it, even when talking about taboo subjects.
And it wasn't just Chaucer, right? You mentioned other writers who tackled sexual themes in even more explicit ways.
Oh yeah. There's this 14th century Welsh poem called William the Penis. It literally personifies the male member and complains about its unruly nature.
William the Penis. That's amazing. What kind of poem personifies a penis?
It's surprisingly self-aware and funny. It's a mix of boasting about sexual prowess and lamenting the struggles of controlling one's urges.
It sounds like a medieval precursor to modern stand-up comedy.
Maybe it is. And then there's The Maidservant's Holiday, a 15th century poem told from a woman's perspective. It describes a sexual encounter in a field in pretty graphic detail.
Wait, so they were writing poems about casual sex back then? That's bold.
It is. And it suggests that they had a much more open and matter-of-fact attitude towards sex than we often give them credit for.
Yeah, they weren't as hung up on the same taboos we have today. And it wasn't just the content, right? They even had their own special language for talking about sex.
Exactly. They had all sorts of euphemisms and slang terms.
Like hammering and squirrels eating nuts.
Right. They weren't afraid to talk about sex, even if they did it in a veiled or humorous way.
It's like they had this secret language, a way of getting around social conventions without actually being silent about these things.
Exactly. And that code switching, that ability to jump between the formal and the informal, the sacred and the profane, is what makes exploring medieval culture so fascinating.
It really is. It's like piecing together a puzzle, looking for clues in their art, their literature, even their jokes, to get a sense of how they truly lived and experienced the world.
And the more we learn, the more we realize that the Middle Ages weren't this monolithic block of piety and repression. It was a time of incredible creativity, complex social dynamics, and, yes, a surprising amount of openness when it came to sex.
Speaking of openness, all this talk about art and literature reminds me of something we mentioned earlier. Those public bathhouses. Weren't they also known for being, shall we say, hotbeds of activity?
Oh, absolutely. Public bathhouses were a central part of medieval social life, a place to relax, socialize, and, yes, sometimes even more.
It's funny to think that something we consider so private today, bathing, was such a public affair back then.
Right. Men and women would bathe together, often nude, which made it a prime spot for flirting and more. In fact, the term stew, which became slang for a brothel, is directly linked to these bathhouses.
So going for a stew meant a bit more than just getting clean.
Quite a bit more. And this link between bathhouses and sex shows up in other ways, too. The 14th century slang term for sex workers, lavender, comes from the lavender used to scent bathhouses and laundry houses. It highlights how intertwined these activities were.
So you could go for a soak, get your clothes cleaned, and maybe even find a little romance all in one place. It was like a medieval one-stop shop.
Exactly. It just goes to show that even back then, people found ways to combine business with pleasure.
Speaking of pleasure, we haven't really talked about how people in the Middle Ages shared stories and jokes, especially the more risque ones.
Oh, those medieval folks loved a good dirty joke.
Yeah.
And these tales weren't just confined to taverns. They were shared everywhere, even among the elite at fancy banquets.
So imagine you're at a royal feast, surrounded by knights and ladies, and someone cracks a joke about pubic hair.
It might seem shocking to us, but it was just part of the entertainment back then.
There's this great example from The Maidservant's Holiday. The poem ends with a woman sticking her backside out of a window and telling a suitor to kiss it.
And the punchline is that he's surprised to find she doesn't have a beard.
Okay, that's hilarious. It's so unexpected, especially given the time period.
It really challenges our assumptions about what was considered appropriate humor in the Middle Ages.
It makes you wonder if we've actually become less open about sex in some ways. Today, it feels like we've sanitized it, made it this private, often shameful thing.
It's an interesting thought. We don't have public bathhouses or share body tales at dinner parties anymore. Maybe we've lost that sense of playfulness and acceptance that seems to have existed, at least to some degree, in medieval society.
Maybe we have. It's something to think about, right? I mean, it's easy to judge the past based on our modern sensibilities, but maybe they are onto something with their more open approach to sexuality.
Perhaps. It's all part of the complexity of human history, isn't it?
It is. And speaking of complexity, I'm curious about the specifics. What types of sexual activities were actually practiced in the Middle Ages? And how did society view them?
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own deep dive. That's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our medieval sexuality adventure.
Stay tuned. Things are about to get even more revealing. Welcome back to our deep dive into medieval sexuality. We've busted myths, explored societal norms, and even peeked into the world of medieval art and literature. You know, all the stuff they didn't teach you in history class.
It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? From penis trees to weasel testicle contraception.
Weasel testicles. Okay, we'll have to circle back to that one.
We've learned that medieval folks were way more complex than we often imagine.
Totally. And today, we're getting into the nitty-gritty the specific types of sexual activities that people engaged in and how those acts were perceived. We know the church pushed procreation as like the main purpose of sex within marriage, but surely there was more to the story than just making babies.
Oh, absolutely. Human desire is way too multifaceted to be confined to just one purpose. And even within marriage, there were ideas about good sex versus bad sex.
Yeah, we talked about that whole marital debt thing, the obligation to have sex with your spouse.
Yeah.
But even then, there were rules. Certain positions, full nudity, all forbidden. It all sounds very, clinical and joyless.
Right, because the church was trying to regulate even the most intimate aspects of married life. Anything that couldn't result in pregnancy was considered suspicious, even sinful. And that brings us to the big, bad word of the Middle Ages.
Let me guess. Sin.
Close, but even more specific. Sodomy.
Sodomy. That seems like a pretty loaded term.
It was. It was a catch-all term for any sexual act deemed unnatural or non-procreative. And it went way beyond just same-sex relations. Anal sex, oral sex, even masturbation all fell under the umbrella of sodomy.
Wow. So basically, anything that wasn't penis and vagina for the sole purpose of making babies was considered, sinful. Talk about pressure. Did these rules actually stop people from engaging in these unnatural acts?
Of course not. Human nature always finds a way. While sources about these taboo topics are, understandably, scarce, there are hints that reveal a more complex picture.
Like those stories we talked about where men worried about getting a woman pregnant if she was on top during sex.
Exactly. That shows that people were aware of different sexual positions, even if they weren't officially sanctioned. And don't forget those court records from Florence, where we see evidence of men having casual sex with other men and even forming long-term committed relationships.
Right, those records are fascinating because they show that same-sex desire existed and that people found ways to express it, even in a society that condemned it. It really makes you wonder what we're missing from the historical record, especially when it comes to women.
You're right. Sources about female same-sex relationships are even rarer, which makes the few existing records all the more valuable. The case of Yen and Lawrence, those two women who were punished for their relationship, really stands out. It makes you wonder how many other women managed to keep their relationships hidden from the authorities.
So even within the church's strict rules, it seems like there were degrees of sinfulness when it came to sex. I remember reading about a man who confessed to having sex with another man, but was adamant that it was intramural intercourse, not anal, because that was considered a lesser sin.
That's a perfect example. It shows that even within what was considered unacceptable, there were nuances, gradations of transgression. It wasn't simply black and white.
It's a good reminder that our own views on sex are constantly evolving too. What was taboo a few generations ago might be perfectly normal today, and vice versa. Morality and social norms are always shifting, shaped by culture, time, and place.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural expressions, we've talked about how medieval art and literature often depicted sex in unexpected ways. But there's another intriguing element we haven't discussed yet. Pilgrimage badges.
Pilgrimage badges. Those little souvenirs people brought back from their religious journeys. What do those have to do with sex?
Well, some of these badges were surprisingly explicit. They depicted genitalia in all sorts of creative ways.
Wait, seriously? People wore badges with penises and vulvas on them?
They did. There's one famous example of a vulva wearing a crown being carried on a litter by 3 phalluses with legs and tails.
Okay, you've got to be kidding me. That is amazing.
Yeah.
But what did it all mean?
Well, while pilgrimages were about spiritual renewal, they also offered opportunities for, let's say, earthly pursuits. People were away from home, away from the watchful eyes of their communities.
So like a medieval spring break.
You could say that, and there was this idea that since pilgrims were under plenary indulgence, meaning all their sins would be forgiven, they had a little leeway to indulge in behaviors that might otherwise be considered off-limits.
So a little sinning on the side was okay, as long as you were on a holy mission.
Essentially, yes. And these badges, with their explicit imagery, might have reflected that sense of liberation, that temporary freedom from social constraints.
Or maybe they were just a way of having fun, poking fun at the whole seriousness of pilgrimage.
Exactly. And that's what I love about exploring medieval sexuality. It's full of surprises, contradictions, and that playful, subversive spirit.
It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. It's like we've been looking at this period through a very narrow lens, and suddenly the whole picture has exploded with color and complexity.
That's the power of history, isn't it? It challenges our assumptions, broadens our perspectives, and reminds us that the pulse is never as simple as we think.
So, what have we learned from this deep dive into medieval sexuality?
Well, we've learned that it was a time of contradictions, anxieties, and desires. Much like our own time, really. It was a world where the church tried to control people's intimate lives, but individuals still found ways to express their desires and navigate the boundaries of what was acceptable.
We've seen how humor and playfulness were intertwined with anxieties and fears, and we've learned that the history of sexuality is never static. It's always evolving.
Exactly. And maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Human nature, in all its messy, contradictory glory, has always sought connection, pleasure, and love, regardless of the rules and restrictions of society.
That's a beautiful thought, and one that resonates even today. So thanks for joining us on this incredible journey back to the Middle Ages. It's been an eye-opening experience, to say the least.
We've only scratched the surface, though. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the hidden stories of the past.
And who knows, you might even uncover some surprising truths about yourself and your own relationship to sexuality along the way. That's all the time we have for today, but be sure to visit 1337podcast.com for more deep dives into human behavior.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Strength and honor. I am Spartacus.
Thanks for watching. Tap into 1337podcast.com.